Thank you so much. Thank you to the audience. I know you've been waiting to ask your questions. I'd like to go to Kavita first, if she would like to. Okay, her question has been a bit answered, but Kavita, would you like to ask that live? Otherwise, I can of course read it out for you. Okay, I'll just ask a question for Kavita. So Kavita Lakhani, as you know, she leads communications at Golin, and this is an open question to all the panelists. Can you please list one or two companies operating in India that rank high on ESG compliance? And they're requesting that you don't name your own organizations. Who would go first? Arijit? Yeah. Sure, Sarika, please go ahead. Go ahead, Sarika.
The top of the mind is the Tatas. I mean, the whole Tata group, but that's top of the mind. But yes, there are many others as well.
Thank you, Sarika. Arijit and Priya and Nitin, would you like to? Though I have to say that you do belong to companies.
Parul, it's easy because actually Priya's company is doing very well, and we look at them very carefully because they are in a sector which is also which is seeing now a huge shift to from fossil fuels towards electric vehicles, and that's a huge shift that is otherwise also happening. So I think that the Mahindra Group obviously is one which is doing pretty well, according to me as well, in terms of other aspects also, whether it is corporate governance issues and many of them.
Thank you, Arijit. Priya, would you like to mention, and then Girish? You're on mute. You're on mute.
I would say we look up actually to the international firms like IKEA is doing some amazing work as far as ESG is concerned. So we look up to them actually for the kind of work that they do. I would also look at P&G also is doing amazing work, especially in India too. So these are the companies that would do. Unilever. So there are tons of companies actually out there who are doing amazing work. We are looking internationally too for that.
Thank you, Priya. Girish, can you unmute yourself? And yes, please go ahead.
So Kavita, I'm going to follow your request and not name my own company, but I will definitely name all my clients on this panel. So Renew Power, Max Group, and of course, like Arijit said, we all sort of look up towards the Mahindras and the Godrejas, and I think the Infosys is also a no-brainer.
Okay, that's great, Girish. I'd like to ask Nitin and Matt as well to contribute the names.
So very quickly, the top constituents in India are, some of them have been named already, are HDFC, Infi, TCS, and there's amongst the banking sector mentioned HDFC, there's Axis Bank as well, if I'm correct, and then HUL. Staying away from naming M&M, we were asked not to name companies which are not a part of this, but I think the other one that I've left out is Wipro and Bharti. I think these sort of constitute.
That's an interesting list. Matt, I'd like to end this question with you.
Sure. So I'm not going to comment on individual Indian companies because I've not worked in India for nearly 2.5 years now, so I'm a little bit out of date. What I would do instead is to pick up on the point that Priya said. Look at some international businesses that have an Indian presence and look at what they're doing. And I would actually highlight the B Corp movement. So for those of you who don't know this, the B Corp movement is one of the most important things that's happened in business in my lifetime, I would say, because a B Corp has a change in its articles of association, so its legal documents, the legal obligations on its directors that requires it to treat stakeholders on equal terms as shareholders. So it has to factor in the impact of its decisions on people and on planet, as well as the impact of its decisions on its shareholders. The biggest B Corp in the world is Danone, the food group.
The food.
and they are an extremely impressive company. I personally would put Danone above Unilever in terms of progressive vision. So have a look at the B Corp movement, and have a look at Danone.
So two very quick questions for you, Matt, before I go on to the next question. Firstly, this B Corp movement, is it policy dictated, or is it something that companies voluntarily adopt and make legal for themselves?
So it's voluntary, and the reason why that matters, and actually I've just typed an answer in the chat to a question about what do companies need to change. The problem here is company law. Worldwide, in the UK, in the US, in France, in Germany, in India, everywhere, company law requires companies to establish shareholder primacy. It requires companies to prioritize the creation of value for its shareholders above all other factors. And until that changes, ESG, however much investor pressure there is, will be something that companies choose to do rather than they have to do in terms of aligning this, people and planet responsibility with shareholders. B Corps is a voluntary arrangement, but it's a legal commitment. So a company can choose to become a B Corp, but once it's done that, it has a legal obligation, as in its directors can be sued for large amounts of money if they don't follow those obligations. It has a legal obligation to put people and planet on the same legal status in terms of their obligations as their shareholders.
One final question for you, Matt. The EC mandated, global standard which might come in. How soon do you see that becoming a rule?
So the latest thinking is, the European Commission's reasonably optimistic that this will be adopted in full by the end of next year. It would then, there's then yes, but that's an optimistic assumption on their part. But there's then a transition period. So I would say reasonably across Europe by the end of 2023. So basically, I'd say 2 to 3 years from now. Once it is established, Europe is becoming the center of global standard setting in many areas. I think you would then see it move across to the US within 3 years after that, and then elsewhere in the world, certainly by the time you get to about sort of 27, 28 at the very latest worldwide. And that's probably pessimistic on my part. I would say larger companies will be thinking very hard about how that EU taxonomy affects how they look at ESG by 2025 at the latest, including in India.
Thank you, Matt. Two more questions for the panel. I think this question would be good for Priya or for Sarika. It's a very specific anonymous question. How important is ESG for a private limited B2C firm? So it's a fairly technical, very specific. Priya, Sarika, would you be comfortable answering that?
Sarika, you want to take that?
Go ahead, Priya, and I'll be happy to chime in.
Okay. So I would say that for any private sector company, actually, especially in the B2C space, wherein branding, the brand sticks actually. What is the kind of branding do you want for your company? ESG is very integral to making of that brand. And I feel that as the years go by, customers will get more focused. Green consumerism is on its way. So it's very much upon us, considering what has happened during COVID also. You'll see an impact of it on our basically decisions that we take on buying. And I see it only progressing. So if you want to be successful now, it's very important that ESG be part of your narratives, especially on brand building.
Thank you, Priya. I'm just going to request Vineet to come in. Vineet, you have a question. Please go ahead. Would you like to ask it live? You can unmute yourself. I'll just, okay. Go ahead, Vineet.
Hi, Matt and everybody. Sarika, Priya, Nitin, Arijit, and Girish. Very interesting talk. Now, from an India perspective, as Matt, you've been talking about, where we have 2% mandatory spend on CSR. How important it is to really talk about ES, because it's by law now, and hide the governance issue under the umbrella of ES. And what happens is this is like a very very typical. If you look at the largest crisis which India has seen in last probably 10 years or 5 years, it's all about corporate governance crisis, right?
Yeah.
And the companies have been a huge spender on social, environment, everywhere, right? But when we look at the corporate governance, I think they have struggled there. Now, as a communicator, I always struggle to give that horror, and I think Priya talked about this very well. That how do we communicate back to them and show this that ESG is complete. It's not E, S, and G. So you need to look at all three pillars in the same manner and act upon that.
Yeah. Can I just briefly, government is a big part of the problem here, okay? Because the 2% offset is actually deeply unhelpful, because it encourages the notion that essentially you run your business however you want, and then over here you just spend a little bit of money looking good, and then you tick a box and you move on. And that's not only wrong thinking, that's actually deeply damaging. Is deeply damaging. The whole point about ESG is that it's fundamental to every single thing the enterprise does. Every business decision it makes has to be shaped by its commitment to mitigate ESG risk in all of its forms. And I often say to our clients, ESG is not a department. Yeah. It's not a single activity. It's not something that you can delegate to just to a team of people sitting at the end of the corridor. It's an enterprise-wide cultural change, and it's profound. Yeah, and governments, and not just the Indian government. I would actually highlight the current US government as being actually even worse in this sense. Really, don't often get that. They don't actually understand that. They're still in the mode that says ESG is just the new name for CSR. CSR is essentially corporate philanthropy, giving money to good causes, looking like a good global citizen, a good corporate citizen. It isn't. ESG is fundamentally about the whole business being redesigned to do no harm in any sense. Yeah. And when you have a culture or an administration that itself is struggling to address what are, as it were, systemic ESG risks in the country as a whole, and I come back to my points about corruption in India, it's very, very difficult indeed for governments really to tell companies what to do. It's investors who are leading this, not governments. Investors are the ones who are saying to companies, we consider these ESG risks to be so serious that if you do not deal with them systemically, deeply and profoundly in your business, we are not going to own equity in your company.
Thank you, Matt. So I'm just going to extend the questions for another.
Parul, I'm sorry, Parul.
Go ahead,
Matt,
one very quickly, Vineet.
Very quickly. Matt, last 5 years doesn't say that international investors are bothered about ESG in India. The kind of investments which India is getting, I can, you can go and read about it and check it out. But the kind of investments which are coming in is definitely. You talked about investors and they can tighten the plug, but it doesn't look like.
Yeah, but where are those investors coming from? Which countries? And what kind of investors?
International is one.
Yeah, but so we're going to time out, but I would say sovereign wealth funds, for example, from countries themselves, as countries have poor ESG records, institutional investors that are heavily weighted towards jurisdictions that also have poor ESG records are not a guide to what I mean. I'm not saying that it's still money, it's still legitimate, and actually FDI inflow, foreign direct investment into India has increased over the last 5 years. Absolutely agree with that. I'm making a broader point about the long-term sustainability of the enterprises that investors are putting their money into. And there is an unmistakable global trend across the entire investment community worldwide that says that companies that do not demonstrate they're serious about dealing with systemic ESG risk are less of an investable proposition, wherever they are, than companies that are serious about ESG.
Thank you, Matt and Vineet. I think we can take this conversation further offline or on a Twitter chat. We have run over time, so with the permission of the panel and the participants, I'll spend just another 10 minutes because I still have two more questions. Is that fine? Hopefully that's fine with everybody. I know you all must be very busy. Just two more questions I'll take, and then Moshmi, would you like to come in with your question? She has a question about how startups, whether they need to comply, to what extent do they need to comply with ESG? I'll just let her ask a question. Moshmi, would you like to go ahead?
Hi, good evening, everybody. No, so the question is clear. Anybody of the panelists can just answer. I'm curious because I do hear a lot of, ESG, stickiness for ESG within startups, those that are in the manufacturing, even processes. So would like to hear, the examples that most of the panelists took up very arrived in life, better do it rather than not do it organizations.
I think that's a great question. Who would like to take that? Nitin and Arijit, I think they've not had a chance to comment for a bit. Would any of you want startups?
Well, I have small investments in some startups. So yes, I do have a ringside view on the way some of them operate. I think the biggest thing that defines success for startups is agility, quickness of change. And I think the first thing that startup owe to anybody is sheer survival itself. Should startup focus on being ethically run right from day one? Yes. Should they, focus on responsible community and people practices? Absolutely. They have no option but to be decently governed, given that I think a typical investor takes a whole lot of detail from them before making that decision. However, I think we need to differentiate that from specifically adhering to ESG standards, reporting, adhering to a framework. I think that would become onerous. That takes a whole lot of bad bandwidth as well. And so I think you need to, differentiate between an ethical, well-run organization and being ESG compliant. And I think you need to reach that certain stage to then start doing it in a structured manner.
So, thank you, Nitin. Arijit?
Yeah, so actually Nitin has said it very well. I have only one point. Parul, I have seen, multiple organizations, the organization that I work for, and then as a journalist covering multiple organizations, this is what is built up when an organization is started. For a startup, it is, I think, these values are sort of imbibed right from the beginning. So I think that's why it's very important, as, Nitin said, even if there is no reporting per se, or they're not following any standards. But if these are sort of values that they imbibe right from the beginning, then when the organization grows, automatically it becomes part of the DNA of the organization. And that is something then, as and as the organization gains scale, you can obviously get into the more, part of reporting and doing that. So that is something which comes right at the beginning. So I think, for startups, it's very important. We recently acquired a startup, and I think that was one of the very important factors we looked at when the acquisition was happening.
That's great. So one final question, and then we have to close, I'm afraid. Shalini, you have several questions, in fact. So may I request you to go ahead? Maybe you could prioritize your top question. Shalini, are you there? Or should I just ask for you? Okay, I think I'll just ask for Shalini some of her important questions. In the meanwhile, I hope she's able to join. So
she's
Shalini
there, but she's on mute.
I've actually unmuted her now. So okay. Let me just start the question, and she can perhaps join in. Shalini's question is I think the one very interesting question she's asked is, should there be an industry body to push for ESG compliance by companies in India? The moment I hear the word industry body, I'm afraid I go to sleep right there. But yes, it's an interesting question. Starting with Sarika.
So I'm not fully aware if there are any industry bodies that specifically, rally and help decision making in India for ESG. I'm aware of different other organizations that put this together. I would personally say that it's always good to have somebody who collates all this from different industries. Like from an IT industry, we have a NASCOM, which basically is the voice of the IT industry and helps in decision making for the and helps shapes decision making through the government. So a structured way, a structured body that listens to all the voices, puts some practicality around it, and influences government, which is a very important stakeholder in context of India. I would strongly say that it would be good to have that.
Thanks, Girish. Over to you. Do you have a view on that?
No, I don't, Parul. But I just had one thought that maybe Matt could also sort of clarify. When Maushami is saying, does ESG matter to startups? I guess my thought is it really depends on where the investment is coming from.
Exactly.
Do they care about it? That's it.
Yeah. So I've just put something very briefly into the chat, which is if you need to go out to the debt markets, if you need to raise capital, it doesn't matter whether you're public or private. The people that will lend you money, the people that will, as it were, transfer their capital to you, will look at your ESG profile, even if you're a startup.
Thanks, Matt. I think I'll just convey this compliment for Matt from Gurmukh, one of our attendees. He said he loved your presentation and the way you've answered the questions. So
that's very kind. Thank you.
Thanks from him. Thank you. So I think we've had a really wonderful discussion, and from the way the comments have come in from the participants, hopefully they've said they've liked the freshness of this topic and the content. Just like to have very quick closing statements from everybody. Starting with Sarika, what do you think is your main takeaway from the discussion today?
Well, first and foremost, very insightful to hear from other industries and from experts like Matt, Girish, Nitin, Priya, and Arijit. And thank you, Parul. Just one statement, which I'll echo what actually Matt said. ESG is not going to be one of those fancy things that you just put it as a marketing gimmick. It's going to be the reason why you are successful or not in the future.
Thank you, Priya. Nitin, the closing takeaway from you.
Just one statement. It's very fancy for organizations to talk about far ahead. What they'll be targeting carbon neutrality, etc., and so on in 20 years. I think for communicators, the success would be if they can convince the organization to talk about ESG both for the next quarter and for the next quarter century.
Thank you, Nitin. I think that sets the perspective really well. Priya and Arijit, and then Girish.
So I'll sum it up for myself. ESG actually touches upon every stakeholder you can think of, whether it's your investor, whether you think of your customers, you think of employees. So this is something that communicators can actually utilize really well to showcase how they're doing good ESG practices in their company. So I would say there's no reason for not to look at ESG communications.
Thank you, Priya. Arijit?
Yeah, it was actually enlightening to listen to everybody. Nitin, Priya, Sarika, Girish, and especially Matt. I think it's really good insights. But what I feel is that to save the soul of corporate India, ESG is going to be crucial. I think that is the message that I take away.
Thank you, Arijit. Girish, and then Matt.
So I really, I think I sort of agree with Nitin's statement on, the role of communicators and sort of advocating for ESG communications because it's good for the business, I think is sort of my key takeaway. I also wanted to take this opportunity to just say thank you to you, Parul, for putting this together and this fascinating set of panelists, and thank you to all the panelists.
Thanks, Girish. Good to give the last word to Matt. What should we go away with?
let me begin with thank you to you, Parul, for a really excellent conversation, and thank you to all the panelists and the attendees. A really, really good conversation, much appreciated. So we are all communicators, that is why we're here, and my closing thought would be that the future of the corporate affairs and communications profession is to become the ESG profession. Your careers, each of you as individuals, are going to be intertwined with ESG for the rest of your working lives. So please learn it, evangelize, fight for it, help your companies become better, because if you do that, you will genuinely make the world a better place.
Thank you so much for your comments, Matt, and thank you to all the panelists for a lovely conversation. Thanks, Sarika, Matt, Priya, Nitin, Arijit, and a special thanks to Girish, who's enabled this conversation. For me, I think the biggest takeaway is that things which are supposedly the soft issues are actually becoming the most important things for the future of all of us. So, and thank you to all the participants who, in spite of me running over 20 minutes over time, most of you are still here. Thank you so much. We're all available on email and Twitter. So please go ahead and ask us questions and let's continue to talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.